We begin with the Prime Minister's staunch defense of the carbon tax. It's scheduled to rise in a couple of weeks, adding a few cents per litre to the cost of gas. 7 premiers are asking Justin Trudeau to halt that increase. And in response, Trudeau said the tax actually leaves most Canadians better off financially.
And that's an easy thing for short-term politicians, short-term thinker politicians, to say, oh, we'll get rid of the price. They don't talk about the fact that they're also going to get rid of that check, the Canada carbon rebate, that puts more money in the pockets of the vast majority of Canadians. Doing the right things today that support people today, that deliver that better future a generation from now, 2 generations from now, is going to make a huge difference in the path we take forward.
Dennis King is the Premier of Prince Edward Island, and he joins me now. Premier, welcome back to the show.
Great to be back with you, David.
So you're one of the many premiers writing letters to the Prime Minister this week. You've called this a punitive and unfair tax. Why do you think this disproportionately affects people on P.E.I?
Well, when you look on April 1st, carbon tax will make up about 23.4 cents of the total price of gas in P.E.I, and it'll be higher in terms of diesel as 27 or 28%. You add another 4 cents on with the clean fuel tax. And it's a big hit for us at the end of the supply chain here to have all of these added costs passed along. I'll be the first to say, as I said in our legislature last week, that the carbon payment and the offset certainly helps. But when it comes to the cost of living here and the cost of groceries, all of those factors get passed on to the end consumer here. And it's part of the reason why our prices are stubbornly higher than everywhere else.
There's a lot of things driving up the cost of living, but none of those come with a rebate the way carbon pricing does. So why isn't the rebate enough to offset its role in what you see as a cost of living crisis in P.E.I?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm the first to say the rebate certainly does help. But our position here really hasn't changed since I came into government in 2019, is that, the carbon tax seems to be a stick approach where the carrot approach works much better here. And I'll give you a classic example. Through our heat pump program, which the federal government has now come on board to assist with, we've displaced over 35% of our furnace oil usage in Prince Edward Island in the last 2 years. It had nothing to do with the cost, but it had to do with investing and helping those islanders who want to adapt to find other alternative uses and other programs. So that's what we have been lobbying for from the very beginning, is that we want to and share the goals of the federal government. Let's work together to try to achieve them and make sure islanders and Canadians don't have to suffer in the process.
I don't know if you saw the Prime Minister at his press conference earlier today in Alberta. He just met with Premier Daniel Smith out there, who I'm sure you do know is no fan of their environmental policies, but he didn't sound like a guy who's about to press pause on this on April 1. He was defending the rebates, defending the plan, defending the progress the country has made towards hitting its emission reduction targets. Have you had any response? What's your sense of how receptive the federal government is to this?
One of my fellow premiers texted me to say that he referred to us as short-term thinkers, which, I like the Prime Minister. We work well together. I've been very supportive of many of the initiatives. We share common goals along the way here, but I don't want to get into name calling. But again, I would reiterate that the progress we're making in reducing our per capita carbon here and helping life be more affordable for islanders has nothing to do with putting a tax on the price of gas and diesel. It's actually investing in programs that islanders can find other alternatives for uses compared to what other jurisdictions have. So that's what I continue to want to focus on. I've convinced the federal government over the past couple of years to assist in our heat pump program, which has served us really well. We're now in P.E.I, any household up making $100,000 income or less get a free heat pump. That program's going through the roof. We have Toonie Transit. We have all of these initiatives here that we're working to help incentivize islanders to reduce their carbon footprint. And I'm not sure at this time, with the cost of living and the inflationary pressures being what they are, keep adding to the costs at the end of the line is helping anybody get to either one of those goals.
I heard that comment from the Prime Minister. I took that to be directed at people who want to scrap scrap the carbon tax, not pause the carbon tax. So
Okay.
I don't know, maybe I'm misinterpreting it, and and I'm also not a premier writing him letters, so I don't know how I would feel about it. But what is your sense of where he goes with this? I mean, he clearly, this is a signature policy for them, and one that is unraveling in terms of public support and a political consensus from when it began in 2016. I mean, do you think that they'll just keep pushing through despite opposition from pretty much every first minister in the country, or the majority of first ministers in the country?
Look, I certainly think all premiers can relate to the challenge that the Prime Minister is facing. We would each have our own situations within our jurisdiction where there's pressures from one group or another to do things. So I understand and I appreciate the position that he's in. They were very open-minded to remove the cost of carbon for furnace oil here in Prince Edward Island, in Atlantic Canada, and across the country, which was great. So, I mean, my job at the end of the day is to continue to lobby for Islanders. What Islanders are telling me is what they've been telling me since 2019. We want to reduce our carbon. We want a cleaner environment, but we think there's ways to do it without taxing our ways into making the cost of living unbearable for Islanders. I'm going to continue to pursue that. I like the Prime Minister. I wish him well in his job, but I have to work for my constituents, and that's what I'm doing here.
No, and I can understand that. I just wonder, you're doing it this way, making your position known, speaking to people like me. Will you ever do anything like what Scott Moe is doing in Saskatchewan, where they just refuse to remit the revenue to the federal government and potentially face legal consequences? Do you think that's an acceptable way to deal with a political disagreement like this?
I think every jurisdiction has to look at their own individual situations. We wouldn't be in a situation like Scott Moe is in Saskatchewan. We don't own our utility. We don't own the resources and things that Saskatchewan does. I respect what each jurisdiction and each premier are trying to do here. I do think there's a way forward for all of us that we can work toward the goals of reducing our carbon footprint, doing a good job here in the country, but also remembering that we all have to live here every day. And life has been challenging over the last year, particularly for citizens of places like Prince Edward Island. The cost of living has been high. It's been hard, and we can't just look into the future and say we have to fix things in the future without doing some things here now. And I continue to be optimistic. I think we can find ways to do this. We've been doing it here in P.E.I. Our success would be the same with or without a carbon tax. I don't think that's made a difference for us one way or the other, and I suspect other jurisdictions would feel the same way. So
Premier, we have this widening disagreement on the environmental plan of the federal government, mostly on the carbon tax. At the same time, the federal Liberals are pursuing a national dental program, a national pharmacare program, at least in some capacity, the conditions of which were largely, at least in the initial stages, negotiated with the federal NDP and not with the provinces. Well, what is that approach and this disagreement doing to the broader political national unity situation at the federal provincial table?
That's a difficult question to answer, to be honest. But I do think we're a big country with very, very broad differences depending on where we live. So I do think there's an opportunity through things like pharmacare, for example. We have a unique arrangement that works for Prince Edward Island. I think there's opportunities within a federal program to make allowances for the uniqueness and needs of other jurisdictions. And I hope that's what will happen with dental care. It has to be amazingly frustrating for the federal government to try to come up with a program that's across the board for everyone, that everyone is just going to think works and is enjoyable or favorable. But I do think within our federation right now, we have to understand the differences of jurisdiction and what our needs are in those areas. I think there's a way to do this. It might be a little bit more difficult. It might be a little, off of what we have done in the past in terms of how we've developed policy. But I think we've proven there's ways to do this to make things work for P.E.I., which can work for Alberta and BC and all the other members of the Federation if we roll up our sleeves and try to focus on that as opposed to focusing always on what divides us.
So just a final point on one of the issues that does divide us, which is carbon tax. Doug Ford, the Ontario Premier, said today that if they go ahead with this at the federal level, they're going to be done like dinner when it comes to the election. I mean, what's your sense of the political cost the Trudeau Liberals face in P.E.I. and in Atlantic Canada writ large if they proceed with their agenda on this?
Before I get into politics, I used to be kind of a political talking head, and maybe when I'm done, I'll be one. I don't know. To be honest, I mean, I think people go to the polls and make decisions on a variety of things, but I do think if you follow the polls, cost of living is really one of the biggest things that's really impacting people's decisions and how they might, decide in the next election. So to any government, mine included, I would be wary of the cost of living, and I'd be trying to work and do everything I possibly could to alleviate as many concerns as I could for Canadians and Prince Edward Islanders. And I think if the government was able to do that, that people would look favorably or more favorably upon them when it comes time to mark an X.
Dennis King, the Premier of Prince Edward Island, thanks for your time today.
Great to be with you, Dave. Thanks very much.
The Prime Minister was in Alberta today, making a case for the federal carbon tax in the face of growing opposition from provincial leaders. Trudeau admits the tax may not be popular, but he says it's the best way to fight the future impacts of climate change.
My job is not to be popular. My job, although it helps, my job is to do the right things for Canada now and do the right things for Canadians a generation from now.
The tax is too high, and going up another $15. 7 premiers from different political perspectives are all coming together to say that there needs to be a pause on this tax.
So as Premier Smith just mentioned there, she's not alone in her opposition. 6 of her counterparts, including the Liberal Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador, are calling for the tax to be scrapped altogether or for the planned April 1st increase to be paused. What does all of this mean for the Trudeau government's signature climate policy? Is it in peril? It's time to bring in the power panel on that. Michelle Cadario is a former Liberal campaign director. And here with me in the studio, Jordan Leichmitz is a former NDP strategist. Sherelle Evelyn is the managing editor of the Hill Times. And Tim Powers is a former strategist for Conservative parties. Hello, gang. Good to see you all here. Michelle, let's start with you. When the only Liberal First Minister out there, other than the Prime Minister, is asking you to change your signature climate policy, what kind of trouble are you in?
Well, you don't want to hear that particular beat to the pounding drum, let's just say. And, I think that this has to give the government, some pause, not to do away with the policy, but to perhaps kind of give some thought to a bit of a temporary freeze. And, there's great policy and then there's great outcomes. But if you don't have Canadians behind you, then you can't actually move towards that. And I think that when they brought it in, I think there was a lot more talk around the world about other countries also taking much more stronger environmental actions, perhaps bringing in their own kind of carbon pricing regimes, and that it wouldn't be any kind of a competitive disadvantage. Also, it was long before, interest rates went up. We had a friggin' pandemic in the mid of it that set the whole world crazy. And so, it is right to be maybe rethinking it. And I hope that they are kind of looking at this and saying, okay, who's next coming out to join the band on this drum beat? Because there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of people coming out in support of it. And that's a bit of a trouble. Where are the stakeholders? What are they doing to try and get them there? They've lost the messaging on this issue right now. I don't know that you can rebrand it in any way that's going to make it something that that Canadians are willing to swallow. And so, they've really got to find a way to tackle this issue for the election campaign.
So Tim, the rebate rebrand clearly didn't stick with the premiers. But, you hear from environmental groups today, like the stakeholders that Michelle's talking about there, their analysis shows that this is largely the plan overall. All of it is moving the country towards hitting the 2026 interim targets, being within striking distance of the 2030 targets. Given how much they've committed to this from the jump, could they even consider a pause right now? Because it didn't sound like it today from the Prime Minister.
Yes, it certainly did. In fact, his language sounded a lot like the late Brian Mulroney's, and perhaps that the passing of Mr. Mulroney's having some impact on him as Mr. Trudeau looks at his own legacy here. I mean, you have to think that carbon policy writ large, climate change is something that this Prime Minister wants to be remembered by. and 4. So if he capitulates now, because that's the way it will be framed, it's hard to imagine any political benefit for him. And then maybe he has some legacy items around daycare, though that, of course, has its challenges at the moment as well, too. But you have to think if he was going to do the pause that Premier Furey suggested, and to be fair to Premier Furey, as you know, it's not the first time he suggested this either, you would have thought he would have done it at the same time they did the carve-out for home heating oil, which, by the way, has not produced any obvious political benefits for him. So if you're Justin Trudeau, Michelle's right, they've never told the story right on this. It's not getting any better. So if you're not going to get political benefits out of this, even if you change it, but if you change it, you have more political challenges internally. Stephen Guilbeault walks, probably.
Yeah. What
happens to the people who support you? Why would you move at this point? He seems very comfortable giving that line that, sometimes you have to do what's unpopular. I don't think I've ever heard him say that before. That's new for him. So there's nothing suggesting in his language today, from what I'm hearing, that he's ready to back down. Though I think, if he did listen to the premiers, that would be helpful to citizens, but I don't think he's about to do that.
But Shirley, it seems to me, not only is he not prepared to back down, but thinks it would be the wrong thing to back down. He used the phrase short-sighted. He was talking about politicians who want the carbon tax scrapped, not necessarily the pause, but he made it clear and used this to attack the federal Conservatives and the access tax tour that it just doesn't sound like they're going to move.
No, it doesn't. And, and for all those reasons I think that Tim just laid out, it wouldn't suit him. I know that Premier Smith also said today, that she told him that, you might get some political win from this if you were to do this. And I'm sure he took with a massive, horse-sized cube of salt.
The Liberals are going to win Red Deer, right?
Yeah,
if he moves, right?
Exactly. It's not going to happen. Just the same way he's probably not going to fire Stephen Guilbeault as his environment minister simply because the premiers are saying that they would prefer if he was no longer around the table. But it does pose an interesting quandary because when you're standing out alone on this, essentially, you have no allies. You don't really have anybody around that First Minister's table to really back you. I mean, we haven't heard too much, I don't think, from the territorial leaders on this.
Yukon Premier P.E.I said they're not going to ask for it to be paused, that they're happy to see it go this way. I know there's some issues with the Northwest Territories because they're going to be moving on, I think, to the federal backstop.
Yeah.
Lob Canoe wants to take it off home heating, but not necessarily on the global picture. But, the overwhelming consensus, the people on the backstop are done with it.
They're done with it. Okay. So when you don't have those allies, in other cases and other issues, sometimes he could look to one premier or another. Sometimes Doug Ford in Ontario has been on his side for some things, not this one, even though he tried to couch it today as saying whether they'd be annihilated because of this.
Yeah, done like dinner.
Yeah, so that's all, I think, feeding and fueling the Prime Minister into saying, you know what, no. Just because everybody's so against it he's in that language of it's not about what's popular, it's about what's right. He's basically entrenching himself to say, I am right. That's not... he doesn't have the best reputation on that kind of intransigence, where he's, sets his feet and says, I am right, I am correct on this. We saw it with, SNC-Lavalin and other things like that. Not to say that this is the same thing, but you get that sense of people kind of side-eyeing him a little and saying, why are you so stubborn on this? So that stubbornness, it could be for the benefit of the country. Like you said, we're getting closer to the targets, but people are feeling the pain in their wallets, and that's what they're going to remember or think about right now.
Jordan, I know they are, they wanted to send signals to investors and business that this is the path, this is consistent, and we're not going to, shrink back from this just because times are tough. But the world has a way of intruding, as they say, and it's intruding big time right now.
Yes, and in a lot of ways they're in the worst of all worlds, and a good chunk of it is their own doing. I think that really you can trace back some of their real weakness on this issue to the day they decided to do the carve out for Atlantic Caucus on home heating. Once you start pulling at that one thread, you're admitting that this is in fact an affordability issue for people across the country. And so to me, it's really staggering to see that they made that carve out at great cost to them and to the credibility of the program, only to now turn around and have all 4 Atlantic premiers speaking out against the whole thing. So there was really no benefit for them now in doing that. And it's really placed them in a difficult position because they're not reaping any political wins, but they're now stuck with this chink in the armor. And I think the messaging today that the Prime Minister was using in terms of this being tough medicine is really unfortunate because it's moving them off some of the potential positive space where they could talk about some of the good things that they've done on climate change, on investment, on green jobs, on all of that type of stuff that we know Canadians need and want for the future. And instead, it sounds lectury. It sounds really detached from the realities of people like, I know you're suffering, but it's got to happen anyway. And this is just not a message that's going to resonate with anybody. So I think they're absolutely in a trap, but it's one of their own making.
So, Michelle, on this, the premiers have been sending all kinds of letters to the Prime Minister. I get the sense Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe could soon get a letter from the Canada Revenue Agency because he is refusing to remit the carbon tax revenues, collect or remit it on home heating fuel. The Prime Minister was asked about this today, and he basically said, look, you can't opt out of the country, you can't opt out of federation, but he declined to say any sort of political action. My understanding is they're going to leave this to the Canada Revenue Agency because this is a violation of federal taxes, essentially, and send the CRA after, not send it, but let the CRA do its work and enforce this with Saskatchewan. What sort of a dynamic does that set up if you've got the Revenue Agency potentially going after a premier and a subnational government that's just refusing to follow the law?
Well, I think that's probably the process there's probably within the CRA, there's some kind of a process with respect to provinces when or not they remit the right amounts or they don't remit the right amounts. It's usually not a full, I'm just not going to do this for you.
Right.
So I think that the process is probably there that needs to be followed. But there's no question this is a political issue. And the Prime Minister was very strong today, and you're right. It does not sound like he is going to back down, and it sounds like they've kind of changed tactics, and he's made this into an issue much more of principle, and trying to really convince Canadians that this is the way that needs to happen, that this is what has to happen, and. I think Tim mentioned Mr. Mulroney, and it does, harken back to some of the GST things that we, that those of us old enough to remember from that kind of campaign and lead up to the campaign. And we still have the GST today. So, there's something to be said for that, of doing something that is probably right for the country. You just have to bring Canadians along, because it does nothing for you if you become so intransigent that you can't actually listen to some feedback, right? There's one thing to completely, abandon your cause and abandon your policy. There's another thing to actually take a moment and perhaps try and find a way to bring more people alongside of your policy. And so I think it's going to be really interesting, caucus, and what's being said in caucus, what the NDP are going to do. Are they going to hold out and be really strong? I thought I saw somewhere that Mr. Poilievre is going to bring forward like 44 votes next week or something like that. So, where is everybody, and is everybody as strong and resolute as he is today?
So Tim, on that, how do you bring people along when you can't get a premier to uphold their oath, to uphold the laws of the country, which they all take when they're sworn in to lead a government? And you are, as Michelle correctly points out, going to face a series of votes on this next week from the Conservatives to try to make it a spectacle and show you voting, for it against it. And what does Ken McDonald do next week? I guess he's voting against the government on this.
Shock, shock.
How do you bring people along when premiers won't comply with the law and your own caucus won't vote for your legislation?
Well, you do something which Justin Trudeau is good at, but it's got him in trouble, is and it's not the holding the line part, but you do have to hold the line, but you tell people why this is important and you try and convince them, though it has not worked so far, that this is the path you need to go on. I think was alluded to earlier, that telling people it's tough medicine is not the right approach, as Jordan said. I think you have to take the loftier approach that this is what matters for the country, this is what matters for the climate, and point it out. But that's a hard thing for Justin Trudeau to do without sounding preachy and parsimonious. I mean, there's no win for him here anymore, David. There is no win other than holding the line and keeping it as a legacy item for him if that's what he indeed wants to do. He is not going to get bouquets and flowers and parades for pushing this forward. So he needs to be as stubborn as his father was in showing that this, in his view, is the right thing to do. And maybe he wins some credit for that stubbornness and determination. Doesn't seem like it in this particular public mindset at the moment. But if he retreats, he looks weak. And what does he do that for?
Yeah, and Sherelle, that's the challenge, because it's not like Scott Moe's suddenly going to say, you know what, I've changed my mind, he's a good prime minister, let's keep him around, right? Like, I don't know who you satisfy by surrendering to a pause when it still remains on the books as a $65 a ton carbon tax, and the rebates that you've been celebrating as increasing on April 1 will not increase as a result if you don't go ahead with the revenue.
Yeah, and that's exactly, especially on that rebate piece. That is the one area where, once they rebranded it and really trying to push, this is about money in your pockets, in the money of Canadians' pockets, and you wouldn't want to take money out of Canadians' pockets, would you? Even though it's kind of one hand takes, the other hand gives. So, but for the governments, they do find themselves in an interesting position, because they will bend on other areas and other things when it comes to affordability. Look at the beer excise.
The beer tax, yeah.
Yeah, so it's still going up, but it's not going up as much, and that's so they've shown that they have that flexibility. And so when you say, okay, well, what about this? And you say the home heating oil carve out. What about that? Why is it that you can't say? Why can't you just give us something in this time of high cost of living, inflation, interest rates, etc. But like I said, they have to hold the line at this point, because if they pull back, then it's like, well, what are we even listening to for anymore?
Right. Quick final thoughts. Switch topics.
Well, this is why it's so unfortunate for them politically that they already basically ceded the point with the home heating carve out. That was the original move that showed the weakness, and now it's very difficult to come back from that. Once you've admitted it is an affordability issue, it's tough to get out. I think they're much better to focus on changing the channel onto topics that are more favorable to them, because this one sure is not.